could be anything really that people like to hate, or that people certainly feel they have nothing in common with. You should be free to be who you want to be. On the other hand, I should be free to say my opinion. And if I think that is not the right balance, but they've been left behind in terms of participation and feeling part of society, they just don't think that their voice counts.
Hello, Irina. It's an amazing privilege for me to have you on the podcast.
Very happy to be here, Vladimir. Thank you for having me.
And when I looked at your journey through politics, it was pretty interesting to me how you're now a councillor for Lib Dem party here in the UK. You have been previously the member of the European Parliament for a while. Not so long, but for a while.
Not so long, no.
So tell us more a bit about your journey.
Well, first of all, I should say that I don't want to deter anyone from becoming a politician. It is one of my passions to support young, striving politicians like you, maybe, to go and stand for office. But my own journey was actually quite a complicated one. It wasn't straightforward at all. I never intended to go into politics. I mean, I had a completely different life as a lawyer working here in London. I grew up in Germany. I came here basically for a job opportunity. And it was really a number of very odd circumstances that led me to become a member of the European Parliament. And I think originally going into politics is usually driven either by a willingness to effect some form of change, by a need of change. You see something and you think, this doesn't work. Let's make it better. Let's make it different.
Or selfishness.
It could be driven by anger, which is the next step up from when nothing happens after years of wanting change. So in my case, I had been wanting change, but probably not enough to give up, the rest of my life for it. So I joined Liberal Democrats quite a long time ago because one of my professors at Harvard was one of the founders of the Liberal Democrats' predecessor party, the SDP, here in the UK. Her name was Shirley Williams. Sadly, she passed away a few years ago, but she was a wonderful mentor, professor for me. She taught a course at Harvard called How to Be a Politician, funnily.
Yes.
But at that time, I didn't want to become a politician. I just liked Shirley Williams. But when I came to the UK, I thought, okay, a party that she helped co-found can't be that bad. So I joined Liberal Democrats because overall their values agreed with mine. And I didn't do very much until 2016. That was the year that I think changed a lot of things for a lot of people because it was marked by two events. The first one was the Brexit referendum in the UK, which came as a shock to many people, particularly to EU citizens like me. And the second one was the first Trump election. So at that point, I remember very vividly, I lived at the time very close to the Polish Center in Hammersmith. And 3 or 4 days after the Brexit referendum, there was an attack in the open street in front of the Polish Center on two people who were speaking Polish. Just because of that.
Because of what?
It was a xenophobic attack.
Was
because
it
they were
because
speaking.
of Trump or...
No, it was
Brexit?
After the Brexit referendum, so before the Trump election. And it was really shocking because we had never experienced anything like that in my neighborhood. So that convinced me that really I had to do a little bit more than just moan. Because a lot of people were moaning about, oh God, this is economic suicide and whatever. And for me, it was a bit more personal. I really felt that leaving the EU was a really almost suicidal act for the UK. And I had to do something to stop it. So that was the anger that drove me in 2016. And from then on, I started campaigning. I started becoming much, much more involved in political affairs in my party. And then when the opportunity arose in 2019 to stand for the European elections, there was very little time. It was very chaotic because we didn't know we were going to participate in the European elections. There weren't supposed to be any for the UK. We were supposed to leave at the end of March 2019. So when we didn't, and the election suddenly sprung upon us, I was very lucky to be selected top of the list for the London list for Liberal Democrats. And we won actually more seats than any other party in that election. So I was very proud to top that list, and I was elected in end of May, took my seat beginning of July, lost my seat end of January the next year. So I only had 7 months. But the whole journey was one of just a lot of chance, circumstance, being in the right place at the right time, or maybe in the wrong place at the wrong time, because obviously we didn't manage to stop Brexit. So in that case, I think my political career failed. But in many other ways, I'm very proud that I was a member of the European Parliament. I was elected the vice chair of the Human Rights Committee. I did a lot of work in these 7 months that I'm proud of, and I wouldn't miss a single day.
Now, regarding this transition from, not a transition, but rather you being elected as a member of European Parliament, you were obviously a member of the Lib Dem party, but you weren't an MP back then, you weren't a councillor.
I wasn't,
so
no.
What got you there?
Nothing. Literally, I had very, very little experience. I think what got me there ultimately was the fact that I wanted to speak truth to power. And at that point in time, I started speaking up without much regard to what the public would say or think, what my party would say or think. And not very many others did at that time. So sometimes it just takes a little bit of courage. It also takes luck. It always takes some luck. But I think if you're willing to speak up, and if you're willing to say what you actually think, so that it comes across as genuine and not as something you just say because you think it's the right thing at that point in time, then I think that is when you really have much more of a chance of being taken seriously and being elected.
It's very interesting that you mentioned the importance of being brave enough to speak your mind about the ongoing political issues, or maybe something that you would like to be fixed, especially as I think over the last few years, in my opinion, and I know to a certain extent this might be influenced by social media, by ongoing political events, by whatever party I support. But my opinion in the last years, lefts and more of the Democrats in the US and left-leaning parties maybe in Europe have gone too far in their censorship attempts. And it has been revealed, and of course, the right-wing parties have taken much of an advantage, much of a opportunity to swap that around, using that narrative that they're being silenced and etc. But I do think that is true to a certain extent, but often also being exaggerated. So
absolutely, I think you're absolutely right. I think there is a degree of censorship. There's also a degree of self-censorship that we have to be aware of. Now, I'm a Liberal Democrat. Liberals believe, obviously, in freedom of speech. I think it's absolutely crucial that we have that ability. On the other hand, we also speak for minority rights, for human rights. So freedom of speech has always been subject to some form of justified limitation. I think that limitation is when it comes to hate speech, when it comes to illegal content, when it comes to protection of minorities, of children, etc. Finding that balance is not something you do on a sort of ad hoc basis, or we're going to cancel this person or not. Finding that balance to me means looking at what democratic institutions, lawmakers have actually legislated for. There is a hate speech regulation in most countries.
I know, in most countries, yes.
There is a hate speech law. So when it comes to the limitation of what you should or shouldn't say, of what you're allowed and not allowed to say, we have legislation. And I think we need to rely on that rather than making it up on the go. On the other hand, I do think there is a good argument that says that it's very difficult to monitor content, for example, on social media. And there has to be a mechanism to protect people from hate speech, to protect people from racial discrimination or homophobia, misogyny in some form or another. So it's a question of balance. And yes, you're right. There has been a backlash against maybe the kind of censorship and self-censorship that we've seen over the recent past. I'm not sure it's a question of left and right politics so much as it's a question of trying to push certain issues in society. And if you do that too much, there's always going to be a backlash. Now, the reason why the backlash is so strong this time is because populist parties abuse the fact that some people think it's gone too far. And then they're always interested in polarizing people, right? So they will exploit the fact that some people think it's gone too far and turn that into a culture war. And that's dangerous in my view.
And many people don't like those hate speech laws, as you mentioned. And in Canada, I think many of the Canadian and in general internet influencers have voiced their concerns against some of the bills in Canada. I think one of them was Bill C-16, which Jordan Peterson is you know Jordan Peterson?
But only by name. I'm not an expert on the Canadian law, I should say, nor on the exact debate there. But it's a debate that we have everywhere, right?
No, yeah. So Bill C-16 basically, I might be wrong there, but in my opinion, that basically enforces you to use correct pronouns when addressing somebody who's transgender, somebody who would like to be referred by any of the other pronouns that you would like to refer them to. And yeah, many of the people, I think, voiced their concerns regarding this as to how far this might go. And with social media, I think that's a good argument. I do believe there have to be certain limitations, but it's also hard when people are existing in an open space like internet and trying to exchange thoughts. Of course, some of the thoughts and some of the content is going to be going to be not exactly right for all parts of the community. And yeah, I think that's something that we really have to tackle and really find the balance.
Absolutely. And as you rightly say, it's all about balance. Now, I feel actually quite strongly about self-determination and particularly about transgender people to be able to self-determine their gender, because there is something called the principle of harm. So that for me is where the balance should be drawn. If it doesn't harm anyone, then it should be allowed, essentially. And the same goes for free speech. So in the same way that I don't think it is harmful to anyone to have self-determination in all aspects of your life, not just in terms of sexual identity, but in all other terms, you should be free to be who you want to be. On the other hand, I should be free to say my opinion. And if I think that is not the right balance, or that there are other rights that are limited or harmed by having maybe too much emphasis on one particular minority, then that's my right and your right to say and to mention. The important thing is that we have the debate, that nobody is censored, that everybody has a right to their opinion. And if somebody feels aggrieved, they need to be able to say so. Because if we ignore them, or if we just put a lid on it and say we don't want to hear it, then, it's not going to go away. It's going to go underground. It's going to go on alternative media. And eventually it's going to find its revenge, usually supported by one of the far-right populist parties. And that's exactly what I can see happening, not just in Canada, in this country as well, and in most Western liberal democracies across the world.
How would you describe a populist leader?
I think a populist leader is somebody who exploits other people's legitimate concerns and turns them into a form of fear, panic, or hatred, intentionally, with the intention of polarizing society, with the intention of gaining power in a democracy. Because the interesting thing is that populism, if you want, is the flip side of democracy. It only exists inside democracies, really, because, well, if you don't have elections, you don't need to convince people. You don't need to turn them around if you want, or manipulate them because they can't vote anyway. So inside in democracy, you will always have somebody who is trying to speak for the people, some construct that they think will unite people against an elite. And that elite, that is either people like you and me, sort of the educated metropolitan people. It could be a political elite. It could be the deep state. It could be anything really that people like to hate, or that people certainly feel they have nothing in common with. And populism strives in situations where I think liberal democracies have failed, because they've left people behind. So a populist leader is somebody who's clever, somebody who knows how to communicate with people, a demagogue, somebody who doesn't really care about ideologies or programs. They only care about power. And once they have power, well, they may not be able to fulfill all their promises and lose that power, or a bit like Viktor Orban, for example, they may reinvent themselves and try to find new scapegoats and new elites they can rant against, like the EU, or like migrants, in order to stay in power. In any case, they're dangerous and shouldn't be underestimated, and they're everywhere.
And do you have such in the UK? And I probably anticipate your answer, but do you have such in the UK, and how big of a threat they are to the
So
country?
you might be surprised at the answer, because beyond the obvious, which is Reform UK, which is very similar to the kind of national populist parties that you see on the right-hand side of the spectrum in lots and lots of European countries and countries across the globe. You have people like Jeremy Corbyn on the left, who are clearly using populist means, promising people free internet or whatever it was, which was very effective, actually, with a lot of people. And although Corbyn and the left-wing populists in the UK didn't gain much traction, or rather were purged by the centre-left, by the Labour Party, I think they are still around. But of course, it is Nigel Farage's Brexit party that is this sort of archetypical nationalist, populist, right extreme party in the UK, and they're coming. The only reason why they're not here yet, or not in greater numbers, is because of our rather unfair electoral system. So 4 members of parliament would have been 96 under a proportional representation system based on the percentage of votes that they got. Next time around in 2029, I bet you they will know how to game the system, and they will be able to get many, many more MPs. So they are coming. I think we need to be very well aware of that threat, and we need to do something, we being the centrist parties and those people who don't want to see our society more polarized. We need to wake up and do something, and soon.
And that's what many people don't realize, is that populists also exist on the left. And it's not only the matter of the right, and they have always existed in a way in the society. People who exploit the fear or the concerns of people in order to turn the situation around and gain power have always been there. And I think it's quite a frequent situation when we as people of a certain country get fed up with one person in power, another person comes, offers easy solutions, might be not so easy, but in any regard, offers some solutions that are relevant for the country, comes to power, does pretty much nothing again, goes away. And it's interesting, right, how Donald Trump in 2016 got to power precisely because of because he managed to raised those concerns about immigration, about the economy, and then people kind of got tired of him, thrown him away, got Biden elected, and now the same situation happens when Biden has to go away because people were fed up with him, and now Trump is again the kind of guy that's opposing the system and that uses this narrative that I'm against that and everybody is against me, but I'm gonna win despite all of the circumstances.
Yes, but I think you're right. There is this sort of wave trend. And yes, there has been some form of populism throughout history. I mean, you need to just look at some of the speeches that we still know from ancient Rome. There were, demagogues. There was propaganda. There was oversimplification. There were empty promises. That's part, if you want, of politics.
I think that's part of politics, absolutely.
Of course. But there is a but. And by the way, you're also right that, of course, the first populists who were called that were actually left-wing populists, and they were in Latin America. There were some right-wings as well, but populism, as I said, so there were people like Juan Perón in Argentina, Gaten Vargas in Brazil, and others who were most definitely populist. The interesting thing is that many of the populists you can't really say if they're left or right-wing. One example would be Bündnis Sarah Wagenknecht in Germany, which is a probably left-extreme populist party who just failed to get into parliament in the recent elections in Germany. But they kind of waver between the two because the ideology is not the important thing. It is the way to get to power. The reason why I disagree with the statement, well, it's always been there and it's kind of the normal way of things, is because there is one important factor that's different today, and that's technology. Technology and the ability today to produce deepfake videos and other disinformation, which is almost impossible to tell from the real thing, that is a game changer for me, because that means that actually debunking disinformation and lies has become extremely difficult. So in the past, because populists lie, that's how they gain power. They promise something that's unattainable. They come up with some weird and wonderful statements about things that are obviously untrue. Well, how obviously are they untrue? Because in a future where you can produce any kind of evidence through AI and it becomes impossible to tell whether it's faked or not, I think it would be so much easier for people to mislead the electorate. And if you have voters who can't tell whether an event has happened or not, whether it was Putin who invaded Ukraine, or maybe it was Zelensky who invaded Russia, who knows, right? Because maybe we will find some deep fakes that point to a new reality. Now, if that happens, imagine, how are people supposed to vote? Does democracy still make sense if you can't have accurate information?
I think there's always been media, and we can always find ways to influence media to change the sort of information that people are getting. So in a way, that's still always been there. Of course, deepfake, when you can completely change the video or create a new one using the AI technologies is of course new, but I don't think we're quite there yet.
Maybe not yet.
I don't think it was utilized by anyone yet.
Oh, no, it was. Maybe not in the way that was completely foolproof yet, because the technology wasn't quite there yet. But you already had massive election interference in many countries, not just the Brexit referendum and the Trump election 2016 were probably the first two elections where we've seen massive foreign interference and disinformation campaigns, including from Russia. China and the Taiwanese elections in January this year was a similar example. They're getting better and better and better. So interestingly, in Taiwan, in January last year, they started very early to counteract disinformation through education. But the actual disinformation was very, very sophisticated, including a lot of videos. Another example that I've seen when I was in the European Parliament, in the Human Rights Committee, was election interference in Hungary, but also in Poland, by the former Polish government party, the Law and Order Party, who had actually used digitally manipulated images of opposition politicians to make them look ugly, mean, stupid, incompetent. You wouldn't believe how subtle but how effective these images were, and how difficult it was to prove that they were actually digitally manipulated, and that it was a very effective campaign. And it is coming, of course it is. And it's very difficult also to say whether they have already changed the outcome of elections that happened in the past. Georgia is another example. We know that there was massive interference in the Georgian election from Russia. Do we know whether there would have been a different outcome? Well, it's always very difficult to prove a hypothetical causality, right? So we will probably never know. But I think it's not a thing of the future. It's already there, but it's going to be much, much more frequent and much more effective with the advent of more generative AI.
I think it's also interesting to argue to which extent, while many people will say, well, this election has been influenced by certain country like Russia, this election has been influenced by China. It's also interesting to argue what's the line you can't cross in influence in election? Because obviously putting information out in the media can be in a way perceived as election interference, but is actually not. So like, what's the line where we can't cross?
I think that's a very good question, because the first question is what is manipulation and what is information and
exactly,
what is opinion? Yeah. So freedom of opinion, obviously anybody can voice their opinion. I think when it comes to a deliberate idea of wanting to mislead people by showing, for example, a fake video, that is where I would see the line, because it's impossible to argue against it, right? You can say, well, this is fake news. Well, anybody calls anything that they don't like fake news. So where I see the line is when it comes to what some people call the post-truth age, when it's impossible to argue anything.
I've heard that before, yeah.
Because the opposite party will simply say, that's a lie. And nobody will be able to know whether or not it's a lie. And the other question is, what is a foreign interference? So I do think that particularly superpowers or so-called superpowers should not directly interfere in national elections. That has been a rule for a long time. So Elon Musk's direct interference in favor of the AfD in Germany, for example, in the recent election, is definitely a step too far.
So when it comes to somebody funding the campaign from abroad, is that election interference for you?
Well, we have campaign funding rules. They are national rules and they're different in every country, and they are there for a purpose. I happen to think that ours in the UK is in need of some reform, because we need to have transparency. We need to have a limit to the degree to which elections can be funded. And yes, of course, if you have, the possibility of buying votes or buying elections, then we might just as well do away with democracy altogether and just admit that the world is now ruled by a very small number of oligarchs.
Yeah, interesting discussion. Because I think with Elon Musk, he stepped foot in his way of speaking, in his way of tweeting things. He stepped foot in many countries, and you can say interfered with many of potentially elections. AfD now gained an enormous amount of votes in Germany, and it could be argued, although, has he funded AfD?
So we don't know the details, but that's neither here nor there, because the mere possibility that he could, and the idea that his influence is such that he can make or break entire parties quite easily, really. And obviously he is not an elected official. that in and of itself tells me there is something very, very wrong with democracy, that somebody can accumulate so much power in their hands that they effectively are running the show behind the scenes. I mean, take the example of Greenland, right? So Donald Trump wants Greenland for the mineral wealth that he suspects.
We don't really know whether he wants it.
Well, let's assume he wants it. Let's assume he wants it because of, some hidden wealth that he thinks exists and may very well exist under the ice in Greenland. There are only something like 65,000 or so inhabitants in Greenland. So paying each one of them, say, $1 million in order to get them to vote in a referendum that they want to become the 51st or maybe by then 52nd state of the United States. That is not a completely outlandish scenario. But is that a democratic way to go about self-determination? I don't know. I think corruption and trying to buy people's votes, that's always existed. What's different is that now there is so much wealth accumulated in the hands of very, very few people that this kind of, if you want, large or super large scale corruption is much, much more likely. And something has gone really wrong there, in my opinion.
But it's very important that in the rise of populism, you admit the certain flaws of the left that to in a way also caused people to believe in populist leaders.
I don't think it's a flaw of the left. I didn't say that. I said it's a flaw of liberal democracies and to some degree of capitalism, which was promising things that they couldn't really keep, which was promising some degree of wealth distribution, but prosperity for all, that was promising that people would have, if you want, not just a free life, but a good life. And the truth is that if we look around this city, our city, London, you would see that that is simply not the case, that there are lots of people who've been left behind, including working class people who are working very hard. And they have been left behind, maybe not deliberately, but de facto, not just in economic terms, but they've been left behind in terms of participation and feeling part of society. They just don't think that their voice counts. Now, that is obviously a fertile breeding ground for populists, but why did it come to that? Why do we have pockets of deep deprivation in my own borough that I represent as a councillor in Southwark? You only have to step across the street. You go literally 3 minutes from the billionaire rows along the River Thames down towards the south, a little bit further south, where you have some council estates where, people live in Dickensian kind of squalor. And it's a shame, really, on our system, on our quite left-wing, but also in if you want, right-wing parts of the country that are governed by the Conservative Party. It's partly even worse. So why is it that these people have been left behind? Why do they feel not listened to? It's not a left-right question, in my view. It's a question of whether our overall system that we call liberal, that we call capitalist and free market, etc., is still serving these people well.
And what would you say? Is it still serving well? Is it the system we should go by?
Well, it's clearly something wrong with it, and it's very difficult to say, oh, that's what we need to fix, because obviously there is no easy fix. One thing I think we do need to fix is income inequality and wealth inequality. Through more redistribution. The other thing but how much is, a very difficult question to answer. And there is a debate even within my center-left party. The other question is what we can do about social integration and about people wanting to feel part of society. I'm a big believer in localism, which means that decisions are taken locally by people who know their environment and have a stake in it and feel that they own, for example, their parks, their streets. They want them to be clean. They want them to be safe. they know where we need to build new homes for, people who are not able to afford homes, etc. And you should give them maybe a little bit more say in their own lives. So localism, where decisions are made at local level and not somewhere far away, I think that helps. The third thing that I think it helps is to involve people in decision making through some form of participatory events, like a town hall meeting or in a smaller community. Some civil society organizations, when you encourage people to just take some form of initiative, that can start in schools. That can start with civic education. That can start with clubs. It can start with blogs like you do, just to give people the ability to maybe speak up and be heard.
And I think there are very interesting developments going on in Europe right now. Now that Europe does not feel that the US will really interfere and help them in case something happens beyond the Ukraine war. And quite frankly, Europe feels that Trump is not going to help Ukraine and Europe with dealing with that war. And as an aftermath of those events happening, European countries have raised a lot of money to fund their military, to become stronger and to be more united. I think it's almost like certainly a good thing, but does that mean that Europe is starting to waken up to the fact that the US might not be as big of an ally as it was before under Biden or whatever years it was before?
Right, definitely starting to wake up, maybe a bit late, but it's interesting because it's actually related to the questions you asked me before about populism and about failures of liberal democracies. Because yes, I think it's a good thing that European nations are starting to wake up, that they clearly can no longer rely on the American security guarantee, maybe have relied on it for much too long. And yes, there is unfortunately a need to really ramp up defense capabilities in the European states. However, who's going to pay for that, right? I mean, Germany has decided to borrow the money, which I think is probably under the circumstances the right decision. 1 trillion euros. 1 trillion euros. Who's going to pay for this? You are. Your generation. Yeah. Maybe not you personally, but the next generation Germans are going to pay for that because they're going to be indebted for, decades to come. Or Keir Starmer's decision, who's going to pay for it? Well, the poorest in our society, if we see benefits, if we see welfare cuts, and of course cuts to international aid. These are the poorest people in the world, and we're talking about people who are already starting to die because of the US administration's decisions to cut US aid funds. So people are dying somewhere else in the world for us to finance our defense capabilities in order to defend Europe essentially from the threat from Russia. And I think we have to keep that in mind. Where does the money come from? Ultimately, somebody is going to pay for it. And I think each country is going to decide that differently. But they all have the populists breathing in their neck. Well, except for the countries where populists are already in power, such as Italy. But they all have, particularly Macron, particularly Friedrich Merz, but also Keir Starmer. They have the populists breathing down their necks who will say, your policies are making the poor people, the left behind, our people, even poorer. The welfare cuts, they're going to play into the hands of the populists. So it's always, again, it's a very, very difficult political decision what you have to make. And I think right now there isn't very much choice left because Trump has effectively put the gun to the heads of European heads of states and has said, you are on your own, deal with it. And they have to deal with it. But the way they deal with it will have consequences for generations to come.
Well, thank you so much for your time, and in my opinion, it has been an amazing discussion.
It was my pleasure, and thank you for having me.